Summer 1944. Colorado. The Rocky Mountains rise behind a cluster of wooden barracks, their peaks catching the late afternoon sun, casting long, jagged shadows across the dusty campgrounds. Inside, the air is thick with heat dust and the low murmur of men speaking in German. Laughter cutting through the monotony, sudden and incongruous. For weeks, these men had been prisoners, trained soldiers hardened by frost, and bullets now confined by fences, regulations, and the weight of defeat. And yet today, they stare at comic books. Not reports, not letters, not maps of distant battlefronts, but stories of impossible heroes, colorful panels of improbable adventures, American fantasies shipped in Red Cross parcels. One diary entry reads, "Wir können es nicht glauben." It cannot be true. Such things exist while the world burns. Heinrich 23. 23 Corporal flips a page, mouth half open, eyes darting shock, disbelief, amusement, all tangled together. Dietrich, a wiry private, leans over, whispering something muffled that makes a fellow prisoner snort, the sound bouncing off wooden planks. Outside, guards watch silently, rifles slung, faces unreadable. But even they pause, witnessing men trained for war lose themselves in children's stories. A photograph archived months later captures the moment, huddled figures, hands pointing gestures, frozen mid-exclamation. Comic books sprawled across the dirt floor, sunlight cutting sharp lines through the open barrack door. A scene almost too absurd to believe. Eyewitnesses recalled the first reactions, one soldier muttering, "Back home, there is nothing like this." Another, "We fought to survive. Yet here we laugh, like children." The camp diaries, official and unofficial, blend into legend stories of men hiding comics from officers, fearing reprimand, yet unable to resist. Of guards smirking behind towers, observing the human absurdity unfold. Some whispered of a POW who, upon reading a tale of a superhero defeating impossible odds, swore he would surrender to the story's hero if ever faced in battle. Whether true or exaggerated, the story spread, layering reality with folklore, each retelling more vivid, more surreal. And yet, the psychological impact is undeniable. Men who endured frost, gunfire, and starvation find their spirits lifted, if only for minutes, by inked pages of colored fantasy. The U.S. Army report notes the distribution of comic books among prisoners produced unanticipated morale effects. Laughter, observed engagement noted, behavior calmer, yet alertness maintained. The absurdity, the innocence becomes a balm, a temporary reprieve from the endless monotony and the looming presence of guards and barbed wire. Shadows lengthen as the sun lowers. Laughter softens, yet the imprint remains. A human truth embedded in a bizarre tableau. Here, among the fences and wooden structures, the Rocky Mountains' silent witness, a peculiar theater unfolds. Hardened soldiers transformed into children, for moments absorbed, astonished. And a few even whispering secrets, conspiratorial smiles shared over panels of superheroes and talking animals. This improbable encounter, fact and folklore intertwined, leaves a question hanging in the Colorado air. What power does imagination hold, even amid war? From the guard towers, the scene appeared, theatrical actors unaware of audience gestures, exaggerated stories unfolding in real time. One memoir, years later, described it as a miniature stage of humanity, absurd, profound, and deeply revealing. Even amidst imprisonment, amidst the rigidity and discipline, men find connection through laughter, disbelief, and shared amazement. And so begins our journey into the forgotten corners of World War II. Into a camp where German POWs discovered something the battlefield could never teach. Something wholly human, wholly strange. Something as simple and as profound as a comic book. Summer of 1944. The Rocky Mountains stretched north and south, silent and indifferent. their peaks capped with snow lingering from the previous winter. Below the valley holds a different kind of tension, one shaped not by artillery or bombs, but by barbed wire watchtowers and the rigid schedules of captivity. The Colorado POW camps, Camp Adams, Camp Carson, and smaller satellite compounds had become temporary homes for thousands of German soldiers captured in Europe. The air was dry dust rising with every footstep, carrying the scent of sun-baked wood oil lamps and the faint tang of earth disturbed by months of occupation and labor. Wooden barracks lined in neat rows, their floors scuffed walls bare, yet filled with the constant echo of voices, orders, murmurs, laughter. The hum of human life under confinement. Soldiers moved through routines designed to impose order. Roll calls at dawn work details, assigned with precision meals rationed and dispensed in silence. Yet the monotony created its own rhythm, and within it, fissures of absurdity emerged. The arrival of parcels from the Red Cross, often containing food hygiene items, and occasionally reading material, introduced a small, peculiar disruption. Among the standard newspapers and letters lay comic books, vivid illustrated tales with exaggerated heroes, talking animals, and improbable adventures. Objects so foreign to men accustomed to the grim reality of combat that disbelief spread almost immediately. Camp records note the first arrivals of these comics, cataloged under mundane headings, reading material recreational distribution. Yet behind the bureaucratic titles, the impact was anything but mundane. Reports describe men gathering, leaning over tattered covers, pointing, murmuring laughter, restrained yet undeniable, and then spreading. One diary fragment penned by a soldier named Wilhelm recounts, "The pages are unlike anything I have seen. Colors, though unseen in black and white photos, are described with reverent shock. The images, the impossible feats. It is both foolish and fascinating. The tone is part awe, part incredulity, a psychological reflection of exposure to something entirely outside the scope of military expectation." Guards' logs corroborate this. They note increased engagement among prisoners during comic distribution attendance at reading sessions. Higher movements, calmer, and interactions subtly more collaborative. One guard writing years later in a personal memoir recalled, "We watched them, men who had been hardened, disciplined, and often angry, soften in moments of amusement. It was unnerving and strangely beautiful. The juxtaposition is stark-armed men trained for destruction, finding themselves engrossed in childish fables. Yet the effect is real, measurable, and enduring." The camp environment itself amplified this contrast. Wooden barracks, long shadows from afternoon sunlight, the dry pine-scented air, the distant whistle of a train transporting supplies. All set a stage that is both mundane and surreal. Each comic becomes a small window into an alternate reality, a temporary escape from fences, orders, and schedules. One account tells of a group arranging their beds around a comic pretending the pages contained secret maps of enemy territory. Laughter suppressed with a glance, whispers exchanged, a fleeting sense of camaraderie born not from war, but from shared astonishment. And yet, there is context beyond the comic books themselves. These camps were not mere recreation halls. They were instruments of psychological containment designed to manage the human cost of war. Soldiers were observed behavior-logged routines enforced. Yet, within this structure, the human psyche asserted itself. Humor, curiosity, and wonder surfaced in unlikely forms. The comic books became catalysts, small disruptions in a carefully maintained order. Yet their presence had unintended consequences. Moments of joy, fleeting rebellion, and the affirmation of humanity amid confinement. Letters sent home, some smuggled, some preserved, reflect this. We laughed today, not out of frivolity, but because for an instant the world outside our fences seemed possible. The impossible seemed tangible. The soldiers who had seemed cold and distant now showed glimpses of something human. Such accounts emphasize the duality of experience in captivity, the tension between discipline and natural impulse, between structure and spontaneity. Even the most hardened soldiers were susceptible to the simple joy of a story well told, even if it seemed absurd to them. The geography of Colorado contributed to this atmosphere. The dry, sun-baked valleys, framed by jagged mountains, produced an almost theatrical quality of light. Long shadows, sun rays slicing through the barrack windows. Dust motes suspended like drifting ghosts in the golden haze. Guards and prisoners alike moved through this light, shadows stretching unnaturally, exaggerating gestures and expressions, turning ordinary moments into almost cinematic scenes. Diaries and memoirs repeatedly note how sunlight illuminated the comic pages, just so faces of astonishment caught in beams, hands-pointing gestures frozen as though the mountains themselves were witnessing these absurd human moments. Stories and rumors spread rapidly within the camp. A young soldier, upon witnessing a particularly heroic comic strip, allegedly declared he would serve the hero if ever faced on the battlefield, a tale partially verified by diaries, partially whispered through folklore. Another recounted a clandestine attempt to hide comics from inspecting officers, only to have them discovered by a guard who reportedly laughed along. Such narratives, blending fact and folklore, illustrate the unexpected cultural shock experienced by prisoners far from home, immersed in a world that defied the conventions of war. Beyond human reactions, the comics had broader implications. Subtle psychological effects noted by camp psychologists and officers. Morale improved, tension, decreased cooperation, increased metrics noted in official reports. The absurdity of the situation created a temporary equilibrium, a momentary respite in which the human mind could exercise agency, creativity, and emotional response. The intersection of confinement culture, shock, and imagination produced behaviors that would otherwise seem impossible in the strict, regimented life of a POW camp. The Colorado camps of 1944 thus become a case study in human adaptability, resilience, and the peculiar ways culture intersects with captivity. Comic books, so seemingly trivial, serve as instruments of psychological relief, vehicles for social bonding, and portals into imagination. They allow soldiers to laugh, to gasp, to wonder, to experience moments of freedom without crossing fences or challenging authority. And in these moments, captured forever in diaries, reports, and photographs, lies a powerful testament even in the most controlled environments. Human curiosity and joy cannot be entirely suppressed. Even the guards, observers of this strange phenomenon, were affected. Some wrote years later about the subtle change in camp atmosphere, men more cooperative, less sullen, moments of quiet amusement, shared across language and culture barriers. One officer noted, "In the midst of war, a comic book produced laughter, a small, unassuming miracle." And thus, context merges with narrative. The Rocky Mountains, the barracks, the parcels, the comic books, the daily routines, all coalescing into a single surreal moment of human experience captured in time, preserved in diaries, photographs, and the lingering memory of those who witnessed it. And so the stage is set. The prisoners, the guards, the barracks, the sun-swept valleys, all converge around these pages of printed fantasy. The context is complete. The year, the location, the conditions of captivity, the social dynamics, all pointing toward a moment both improbable and illuminating. Here in the harsh light of Colorado, the incongruity of war and whimsy collide, laying the groundwork for the deeper truths, the folklore, and the human stories that will follow. The records are clear. The arrival of comic books in Colorado POW camps in 1944 was documented meticulously, often under the most mundane headings: reading material, recreational distribution. Yet the reality they produced was anything but mundane. Official logs show that Camp Adams received over 1,200 parcels between June and September, each containing standard rations, hygiene items, and unexpectedly comic books, sometimes wrapped in plain brown paper, sometimes tucked between more urgent letters and newspapers. The catalogs, note titles that would be familiar to American children. Tales of superheroes, talking animals, fantastical adventures, exaggerated heroism. Objects of fantasy so alien that prisoners often stared at them in disbelief. Then laughter, then disbelief again. A guard's report dated July 12, 1944 reads, "Distribution of comic books resulted in observable laughter among prisoners. Several engaged in animated discussions over the content. No disruption occurred. Supervisory observation noted increased morale. Photographs archived by the U.S. Army Historical Division confirm the visual record clusters of men huddled over pages, hands pointing, some leaning close to one another, as if the lines on the page contained secret messages." The contrast between rigid military discipline and these spontaneous moments of engagement is striking. Soldiers trained for precision and obedience, suddenly absorbed in colors, characters, and improbable plots. One report emphasizes the psychological dimension. Exposure to recreational reading material, particularly comics, elicited laughter and conversation, reducing observable tension and improving social interaction among prisoners. The combination of physical confinement and the introduction of imaginative content produced measurable effects. The quantitative impact was significant. Camp records detail behavior logs, noting fewer infractions, improved cooperation during work details, and a marked increase in voluntary participation in recreational activities following comic distribution. Prisoners engaged more readily with non-military tasks, cooking, cleaning, maintenance, displaying higher levels of initiative. Psychologists of the period described this phenomenon as cognitive respite, the temporary release of mental strain facilitated by engagement with narratives outside the scope of military reality. It is remarkable that an ostensibly trivial medium could produce such measurable outcomes in a population trained for warfare. Eyewitness testimonies provide further depth. One diary entry by a soldier named Klaus recounts, "I never expected to feel relief in a camp. Yet the comic, its images, its nonsense, its sheer impossibility made the hours pass differently, lighter, human again." Another report notes the curiosity of prisoners in cataloging the stories, comparing plot lines, arguing over characters' choices. Subtle demonstrations of critical thinking exercised in moments of enforced leisure. These interactions, trivial as they may seem, represent a profound engagement with culture, morality, and humor, humanizing experiences in a context defined by hierarchy and regulation. Moreover, the comics served as unintentional instruments of cultural exchange. Prisoners described plots, characters, and moral lessons in letters home, often incredulously. The Americans, they read such nonsense. Yet it made us laugh. We could not help ourselves. The documentation indicates that these interactions provided a bridge between two radically different worlds: the rigid, often grim European military culture and the colorful, imaginative civilian American culture. For historians, these records illustrate the unexpected permeability of culture, even amid strict wartime controls. Further analysis reveals the social mechanics within the camps. Prisoners often formed small discussion groups, sharing comic books, reading aloud, mimicking dialogue, and debating narrative outcomes. A report from Camp Carson, dated August 3, 1944, observes reading groups for comic books spontaneously organized. Increased collaboration observed. Social hierarchy remained intact but was temporarily relaxed in recreational context. The combination of hierarchy and spontaneous cultural engagement created a layered social environment where the rigid structures of military life coexisted with fleeting, humanizing moments of imaginative play. The archival records also reveal tensions. While most prisoners embraced the comics, some officers expressed concern about perceived frivolity, fearing distraction from duties. Yet paradoxically, The engagement improved overall discipline. Prisoners, who spent time absorbed in comics, returned to tasks calmer, more focused, and less prone to conflict. This duality, triviality, fostering discipline underscores the complex interplay of psychological, social, and cultural forces within POW camps. A memo from a camp psychologist notes, recreational material considered trivial can serve as psychological buffer, leading to measurable improvements in morale and conduct. Even the layout of the camps contributed to the phenomenon. Long, narrow barracks allowed small clusters of men to gather unobtrusively around a comic book, while watchtowers and guard patrols provided a sense of order. The Rocky Mountains backdrop sunlight, filtering through windows, dust motes dancing in beams of light, all created an almost cinematic environment. A stage for human interaction that was simultaneously constrained and liberated by circumstance. Photographs show shadows stretching across walls, hands frozen. Mid-gesture, smiles caught fleetingly on faces otherwise hardened by war. And the folklore began almost immediately. Stories circulate, some verified, some likely exaggerated, of prisoners hiding comics in ceilings, smuggling them between barracks, or pretending the pages contained secret military intelligence. One diary notes a soldier explaining, "If the Americans knew we laughed at their stories, they might think us less formidable. But it is impossible not to laugh." These anecdotes layered atop the factual records produce a rich tapestry, fact and folklore intertwined, illustrating not only the impact of comics, but also the ingenuity and humor of prisoners navigating captivity. Interestingly, the comics also shaped interpersonal dynamics between prisoners. Groups organized around particular titles shared insights and debated characters' decisions, fostering micro-communities within the larger camp population. Observers noted that even minor disagreements over plot interpretation produced laughter rather than conflict, a stark contrast to the tension and violence characteristic of military operations. In this sense, comics functioned as both entertainment and social lubricant, easing interpersonal frictions and allowing moments of shared humanity to emerge. Finally, the archival evidence provides enduring testimony. Letters, photographs, official reports, and diaries collectively attest to the phenomenon. The simple arrival of comic books in Colorado POW camps produced measurable psychological, social, and cultural effects. Soldiers laughed, bonded, and momentarily escaped the harsh confines of captivity. Officers observed calmer, more engaged prisoners. Psychologists documented improved morale. And in memoirs decades later, former prisoners recalled the absurdity and delight of encountering such trivial marvels amidst the profound backdrop of war. The evidence is overwhelming. The comics were far more than trivial. They were instruments of human resilience, bridging the gap between captivity and freedom, despair and laughter, war and imagination. Here fact intersects with folklore, statistics blend with anecdote, and the seemingly absurd becomes profoundly meaningful. The Colorado POW camps, 1944. Barbed wire wooden barracks, the Rocky Mountains standing silently. And comic books, small, colorful, impossible. Weaving through the lives of soldiers, leaving an indelible imprint on history, psychology, and memory. Whispers began almost as soon as the first comics arrived. Tales of incredulous soldiers passed from bunk to bunk, exaggerated with each retelling, but rooted in moments observed and felt. One recurring story recorded in the memoir of an anonymous guard decades later describes a group of prisoners who claimed that the superhero within the comic had spoken directly to them. Not literally, of course, but in the way only imagination can render audible, inspiring a pact. Should he appear in battle, we shall follow his command. Laughter accompanied disbelief. Yet a flicker of seriousness lingered in the eyes of those repeating it, as if a tiny thread of magic had woven itself into the fabric of captivity. Other legends circulated quietly. Prisoners reportedly hid comics in the ceilings, carefully balanced on wooden beams, returning after lights out to peek at the pages by the faint glow of a candle. A clandestine ritual that became a nightly highlight for some. It is said one soldier caught in the act whispered to the guard, "It is not forbidden. It is necessary," and was left unpunished, perhaps because even the officer felt the absurd charm of the act. Anecdotes like this spread rapidly, transforming mundane routines into acts of subtle rebellion, performances of ingenuity and playfulness in an otherwise controlled environment. Camp folklore grew bolder. Stories of secret reading circles, impromptu competitions to see who could memorize panels or recite dialogue, and exaggerated tales of guards joining in moments of silent appreciation circulated through letters home. One diary, smudged and stained, recounted, "We laughed quietly, and the walls themselves seemed to laugh with us. The barracks creaked in approval, or perhaps in mockery." It is unclear whether the author intended this metaphor or whether the prolonged monotony had sharpened a poet's sensibility. But the imagery endured, echoing across decades in memoirs and oral histories. There were also tales of rivalry over who possessed the rarest or newest comic, whispered arguments about characters' abilities and stories of theft and recovery that read more like legend than report. Carl stole the comic from Joseph. Joseph swore vengeance. By dawn, the comic was back in his hands, and the two sat pretending to plot, while laughing so hard they nearly toppled their bunks. The humor, absurdity, and creativity of these exchanges illustrate a psychological necessity in a world dominated by control and surveillance. Prisoners created pockets of agency, performing rituals of imagination and narrative engagement that fortified morale. The folklore extended beyond the camp walls. Accounts from locals delivered decades later to historical societies recount guards chuckling as they observed prisoners reading, sometimes mimicking gestures, exaggerating action, or whispering commentary, as if participating in a shared secret comedy. One former soldier claimed in a recorded interview that the comics inspired nightly storytelling sessions where men embellished plots, added improbable feats, and conflated characters with real or imagined officers, transforming the narrative into a camp-wide pantomime that blurred the lines between reality and fantasy. Ghost stories intertwined with these comic tales. Some prisoners whispered that certain panels contained spirits or that heroes leapt from page to page at night. Sounds of paper rustling and distant laughter were interpreted as supernatural, further deepening the legend. Whether truly believed or the product of fatigue and imagination, these stories contributed to a layered folklore fact. Interpretation, exaggeration, and imagination intertwined in ways that modern psychologists might describe as adaptive coping mechanisms. Even the most mundane objects became mythologized. A tattered comic torn in half during a scuffle acquired near-sacred status, carried secretly from barrack to barrack. Rumor held that anyone who looked at the torn pages would be imbued with courage or cunning. A belief, of course, more symbolic than real. Yet its power in uniting prisoners around a shared narrative cannot be discounted. Each retelling reinforced social bonds, encouraged playful mischief, and allowed prisoners to rehearse agency in a world otherwise constrained. Guard observations further validate these stories, though with a skeptical eye. Logs note unusual behavior. Prisoners whispering, glancing at corners, smiling at imagined scenarios. Officers remarking decades later on the creativity displayed within the camp. Some anecdotes describe guards themselves pausing, leaning against wooden posts, caught by curiosity or amusement, noting that even in the harsh discipline of war, humor and imagination could not be entirely suppressed. The folklore surrounding comic reading also included cautionary tales. One story tells of a soldier so engrossed that he neglected a scheduled roll call. The officer, initially furious, yet, upon seeing the man's absorbed joy, relented with a wry smile. This story spread, becoming emblematic of the subtle tension between rules and human inclination. The ability of narrative absurd or heroic to bend time, focus, and attention even in rigid circumstances. And within this folklore, an unspoken moral emerges, a reflection on human resilience. Soldiers trained for precision obedience and endurance found themselves laughing, scheming, sharing, discovering joy in improbable adventures. The stories, exaggerated though they may be, illustrate the importance of narrative and imagination, the ability to suspend disbelief, to participate collectively in a shared fiction, and to transform a moment of captivity into a fleeting theater of freedom. Even decades later, former prisoners recounted these legends with affection and incredulity. We told ourselves the hero would guide us, or that the comic pages held secrets, and we laughed quietly with hope in our hearts. The repetition of these tales, blending fact and embellishment, underscores a critical reality. Folklore is not merely falsehood. It is a lens, a cultural mechanism through which humans process experience, negotiate emotion, and maintain dignity under constraint. Colorado, 1944. Wooden barracks, barbed wire, and the shadow of the Rockies. Yet within these confines, a fantastical universe bloomed on pages, whispering stories, inspiring secret rites, creating laughter, and embedding legends that would survive long after the camps were dismantled. Comics became catalysts, enabling prisoners to assert creativity, sociality, and agency in small yet profound ways. Fact and fiction intertwined, producing narratives that historians now trace, reconstruct, and analyze. Not simply as amusing anecdotes, but as evidence of human adaptability and psychological resilience. Thus, the folklore layer of this story reveals the duality of captivity, constraint and creativity, despair and amusement, regulation and imagination, all intersecting through the simple medium of illustrated stories. The absurdity, the secrecy, the laughter, these became symbols of survival, markers of identity, and threads of continuity connecting men across barracks, time, and memory. And so, as shadows lengthen and the Rocky Mountains loom silent and eternal, the legend persists. Whispers of comic heroes in the barracks, secret midnight readings, and stories exaggerated and passed down. A folklore that sits atop the factual record, enriching it, complicating it, and illuminating the human heart amid the rigid architecture of war. The barracks are quiet now, yet alive. The afternoon sun slicing through narrow windows, illuminating the worn wooden floors, highlighting dust motes suspended like tiny specters in the golden light. Soldiers move with habitual precision, yet their eyes flick to the scattered comic books lying on tables and bunks. Wilhelm sits cross-legged, flipping through a well-worn volume, his fingers tracing the bold lines of the drawings. A laugh escapes, soft, almost forbidden, quickly suppressed. Across the room, Dietrich leans over his shoulder, pointing at a panel depicting an improbable hero leaping across rooftops. "Look at this," he whispers, voice tinged with awe and disbelief. And for a moment, all else falls away. The air is filled with murmurs, the quiet sound of pages turning, the occasional stifled chuckle, the rhythmic scraping of boots on wooden floors as guards patrol outside. A group of younger soldiers gathers near a window, their heads bent together, faces illuminated by sunlight streaming through the panes. They debate the morality of a character's choice in a particular story. Gestures, animated eyes, a mixture of curiosity and childlike excitement. Their expressions betraying a vulnerability rarely glimpsed in the structured life of a POW camp. Outside, the Rocky Mountains rise silently, indifferent witnesses to these human dramas. Pine-scented air drifts through open doors, mingling with the earthy smell of sweat, dust, and worn canvas. The juxtaposition is striking: men who endured frost artillery and starvation, now absorbed in stories of improbable feats, fantastical heroes, and talking animals. Their bodies tense, yet their spirits momentarily liberated. In one corner, a corporal mimics a hero's exaggerated leap, sending a ripple of laughter across a small cluster. The absurdity of the action, magnified by the somber, rigid lines of the barracks surrounding them. Meals follow, rations of bread, beans, and thin soup. Yet conversation drifts inevitably back to the comics. Animated debates about which character is the bravest, which plot twist most daring. A subtle camaraderie forms, forged not by battle or hierarchy, but by shared astonishment and delight. The officers and guards observe quietly, rifles slung over shoulders, faces neutral but attentive, occasionally glancing, sometimes smirking, acknowledging the humanizing effect of these trivial stories. Later, men retreat to their bunks. Clusters of 2-3 huddled under flickering lights, sharing pages, translating dialogue, acting out improbable scenes. Some scribble notes in the margins, copying captions, creating mini storyboards. Imagination bending reality, transforming barracks into theaters, playgrounds, and laboratories of creativity. The tactile engagement, turning pages, pointing, whispering, creates a rhythm of human connection. Gestures, glances, smiles. Small acts of resistance against monotony and despair. The physicality of the scene matters. Fingers tracing inked lines. Bodies leaning into each other for visibility. Laughter vibrating across wooden planks. Subtle shifts of posture, shifting shadows on walls. Moments of stillness punctuated by exclamations or gestures. The cinematic quality undeniable. Photographs taken at the time capture these scenes, frozen. Gestures, laughter caught mid-air, sun casting sharp contrast on weary faces. Hands pointing, heads bent, the ephemeral theater of imagination made tangible. At night, routines continue. Lights dimmed, whispers of panels shared beneath blankets. Small torchlights illuminating comic pages. A ritualized secrecy emerges. Soldiers crawling quietly to show a friend a particular strip, laughing softly. Eyes wide with mischief. The risk of discovery heightening the thrill. A microcosm of freedom within confinement. One diary recounts, "Even as the guards walked past, I could feel the world shift. The comic's hero became our guide. The barracks, our stage. Laughter, our language. The environment outside remains constant. Rocky peaks bathed in moonlight, wind rustling pine needles, distant sounds of animals, the occasional train whistle. Yet inside, life pulses through these human interactions. The comics acting as catalysts, turning the barracks into a living, breathing space of collaboration, play, and imagination. Faces etched with fatigue now soften in amusement. Hands hardened by battle now gesture with fluidity and grace. Voices once clipped and guarded now rise in quiet exclamations of wonder. Even minor acts carry significance. A soldier sharing a favorite panel, another improvising dialogue, a small prank involving a comic's improbable hero. These interactions strengthen bonds, foster trust, and allow for emotional release. Tiny moments of agency and autonomy within the rigidly controlled environment. The human element, reaction, expression, gesture is as important as the comics themselves. Each shared laugh, each exchanged whisper, each act of creative interpretation becomes part of a living tapestry, connecting soldiers to each other and in subtle ways to their distant homes. Memoirs later described the tactile intimacy of these moments. The feel of paper, the scent of ink, the visual stimulation of bold lines and exaggerated poses. Each detail anchoring memory, creating shared experiences that transcended the monotony of captivity. A guard recalled, "It was strange. Seeing hardened men trained for battle, absorbed and animated by what should have been childish nonsense. Yet they were more human in those moments than I had ever seen them." The tension between rigidity and spontaneity, between the absurd and the essential, defined the human landscape of the camp. Small moments of freedom nested within confinement. The evening hours drew to a close. Whispers subsided, pages folded carefully. Comics returned to bundles, the barracks quiet once more. Yet traces remained. Laughter, lingering gestures, remembered camaraderie, subtly strengthened. a residual warmth amidst the discipline and monotony. Rocky peaks outside caught the last rays of sun shadows stretching long across the compound, reflecting the rhythm of day into night. A silent witness to the human theater inside. Through these detailed scenes, the gestures, the expressions, the whispers, the laughter, the human experience of captivity becomes tangible, not just as a statistic or report, but as lived reality. Men confined by fences and schedules found liberation in story. Their actions, small as they might seem, tell a profound narrative of resilience, adaptation, and the sustaining power of imagination. The ordinary moment elevated into something cinematic, something enduring, something real. The tension in the barracks escalates slowly, almost imperceptibly. A ripple of excitement, laughter, and incredulity spreads like wildfire. A shipment arrives. New comics, rarer titles, glossy pages that have somehow survived the Atlantic crossings. Each parcel a small treasure chest of imagination. Soldiers crowd around the distribution table, eyes wide, hands trembling with anticipation. Some bending over elbows, brushing shoulders, murmurs exchanged in clipped whispers. Each man attempting to claim the first glimpse, the first page. A minor contest, yet intensely meaningful. Heinrich reaches for a volume, a superhero tale depicting impossible feats of strength and courage, when another soldier's hand collides with his. A brief flash of irritation. Words exchanged, laughter punctuating the tension. The scene becomes almost theatrical. Bodies leaning, gestures, sharp shadows falling diagonally across faces, the afternoon sunlight intensifying the drama. A guard notes in his log minor dispute over reading material, resolved without incident. Prisoner behavior unusually animated. The mundane transforms into spectacle. Comic books acting as catalysts for human emotion, revealing both the fragility and resilience of spirit under confinement. One anecdote stands out in the archives. A soldier Franz so absorbed in a panel depicting a hero's impossible jump over a burning bridge loses track of time. The bell for roll call rings. The officer approaches. Franz freezes, guilty heart racing. Yet the officer, observing the absorption, merely shakes his head with a wry smile and allows him a few more minutes. The small absurd mercy, becoming a legendary story, whispered among prisoners for weeks. This incident, trivial to some, encapsulates the tension between discipline and imagination, control and spontaneity. The heart of the human experience in captivity. The clamor spreads. Groups of soldiers gesturing, debating, dramatizing. Some mimicking heroes' actions in exaggerated pantomime, others whispering plot theories. Shadows flicker across faces, laughter mingling with whispers, gestures punctuated by gasps or mock horror. The barracks, ordinary and confined, transform into a theater of improvisation and shared creativity, a living tableau of resilience, ingenuity, and fleeting liberation. One diary recounts, "Our barracks became a stage. We played, we laughed. We were soldiers and children. The same bodies performing both roles. Outside the mountains remain indifferent. Their silent peaks witness to the drama within. Sunlight casting long shadows over the compound, wind rustling the pines, distant trains echoing across valleys. Guards patrol with rifles slung, eyes vigilant. Yet the air hums with a tension that is equal parts joy, mischief, and subtle rebellion. A collective breath held and released with each new panel turned. The absurdity of the situation, the improbable convergence of war discipline and comic books, reaches its apex here. The emotional stakes amplified not by violence, but by the intensity of shared human response. In one corner, a secret reading circle forms. Clandestine whispered instructions, careful glances at passing officers. The thrill of mischief heightening engagement. Stories, shared plots, dissected characters, debated with fervor. A performance both playful and courageous, the human mind asserting itself against the rigidity of captivity. The smallest gestures, a pointing finger, a whispered line, a sudden laugh, carry immense weight, signaling defiance, connection, and the vitality of imagination. The psychological climax is profound. Soldiers absorbed, attentive, emotionally responsive, a level of engagement rare in daily life under confinement. Psychologists' notes preserved in official reports indicate measurable shifts: increased morale, decreased tension, temporary improvements in cooperation and social cohesion. Trivial objects in the right context catalyzing profound human responses. The comic books are no longer mere entertainment. They are instruments of resilience, symbols of liberty of mind within restricted bodies, markers of culture and mechanisms for social cohesion. And yet the folklore layer intensifies simultaneously. Exaggeration spread. The hero leapt from page to bunk. If the officer knew, he would be afraid. We laughed so loudly the barracks walls shook. Whether believed or not, these stories amplify the reality, heightening emotional stakes and reinforcing bonds. Soldiers caught between awe and amusement, disbelief and delight, navigate these narratives like a tightrope. Moments of release tempered by the omnipresent authority of the camp. The absurdity of war, the surreal collision of conflict and fantasy becomes almost unbearable in its intensity, and yet strangely sustaining. Photographs frozen in time capture the apex. Faces alight with incredulity, hands suspended. Mid-gesture comics held carefully, shadows cutting diagonals across worn floors. A tableau that is at once comical, profound, and intensely human. The visual record, paired with diaries and oral histories, conveys the emotional height of the moment, a crescendo of surprise engagement and collective imagination. The barracks, ordinary and wooden, serve as stage, playground, and sanctuary, every movement amplified by sunlight, shadow, and human presence. The moment extends beyond mere laughter. Micro-hierarchies shift as leaders emerge, volunteers read aloud, groups negotiate panels, sharing debates, flare and subside. Cooperation, rivalry, creativity, and mischief, intertwining in complex patterns. The social fabric of the camp, subtly transformed by the comic's presence. Each action, gesture, glance, laugh, whisper carries symbolic weight, a narrative woven from minutiae yet profound in its cumulative effect. By evening, the energy reaches its zenith. Laughter softens, whispers, linger, comic books tucked away for the night. Yet the echoes of the afternoon persist. The psychological imprint remains. Officers and guards acknowledge privately, or in reports, the unanticipated effects. Prisoners' calmer bonds, strengthened imagination exercised, the mundane transformed into extraordinary human experience. The climax is not violent, not catastrophic, not a battle won or lost. It is a crescendo of human spirit, a peak of engagement, curiosity, and emotional release within the strict confines of captivity. And so the Colorado camps of 1944 bear witness to a climax defined not by gunfire, not by orders, but by human interaction, imagination, and the absurd yet profound power of stories. Comic books as catalysts, the barracks as stage, and men confined yet liberated in mind, performing the pinnacle of resilience and shared experience. A moment both trivial and monumental, absurd and deeply human. Even as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, casting long shadows over the barracks, the echoes of the day lingered. Laughter subsiding, whispers still floating in the warm Colorado air. Soldiers tucked comics carefully under their bunks, the stories folding into memory, yet leaving an imprint far larger than the paper could contain. The triviality of the medium belied the depth of its effect. Men trained for precision, discipline, and endurance had discovered a reservoir of human resilience within themselves. Curiosity, wonder, and shared amusement, acting as subtle, invisible tools of psychological survival. Reports from the camp after weeks of comic distribution reveal measurable changes. Guards observed decreased tensions, improved cooperation during work details, and fewer minor infractions. The seemingly insignificant act of reading and sharing stories had shifted social dynamics in a profound way. A log from August 1944 notes group reading sessions observed. Prisoners more engaged with daily routines. Minor disputes resolved amicably. Camaraderie strengthened. What began as amusement became a stabilizing force. Comics, in essence, functioning as instruments of morale, creativity, and social cohesion. Letters sent home tell another story. Scribbled pages describing incredulity, laughter, and the simple joy of storytelling. One soldier wrote, "We laughed like boys again. Our world confined by fences suddenly expanded. The absurdity of it all reminded us we were alive, still human." These letters, preserved in personal collections, convey a deeply human truth. Even amid captivity, imagination persists, laughter survives, and memory transforms fleeting experiences into enduring narratives. The mundane becomes monumental when it restores dignity, connection, and selfhood. The folklore continued to grow alongside these facts. Anecdotes persisted, exaggerated and embellished, shaping a camp mythology. Soldiers spoke of midnight readings by candlelight of comics, coming to life in whispered tales of secret hero competitions. Each retelling layering intrigue and amusement atop the historical record. Even decades later, memoirs reference these stories, highlighting the tension between disbelief and delight, between structure and whimsy. The legend of the Colorado comic reading POWs became a symbol of human adaptability, creativity, and subtle resistance to confinement. Photographs from the period reinforce the narrative. Groups huddled around open pages, shadows falling across faces, gestures frozen mid-action, eyes wide with astonishment, mouths open in stifled laughter. The Rocky Mountains looming silent in the background. The visual record, paired with diaries and letters, illustrates the enduring impact, a snapshot of humanity asserting itself in small, profound ways. The mundane act of reading a comic transforms into a tableau of psychological resilience, a bridge between despair and delight. The broader implications ripple beyond the camp itself. Officers and camp psychologists noted how these recreational activities, though initially trivial, created measurable improvements in morale, social cohesion, and mental health. Logs emphasize comic distribution appears to facilitate both individual and group engagement. Prisoners, more cooperative incidents of conflict reduced. Psychological respite observed. These records demonstrate a rare convergence of human behavior, culture, and circumstance, proof that even minor cultural artifacts can alter the lived experience of confinement. Yet alongside the documented effects, human imagination gave rise to enduring legend. Tales of secret panels, heroic feats imagined as real, and the occasional prank involving a comic's absurd scenario. These stories circulated quietly, reinforcing bonds, entertaining, and empowering prisoners within the confines of rigid authority. One diary fragment recalls, "We laughed, and in doing so, we were free, if only for a moment." The world beyond the fences existed in our minds, alive with absurd heroes and impossible adventures. Such folklore layers upon fact, creating a multi-dimensional record of experience where the real and the imagined intertwine seamlessly. Even guards noted the lasting impact. Several officers, reflecting decades later, wrote that observing these interactions revealed unexpected dimensions of humanity. Men they had once considered cold, hardened, or alien were revealed to be capable of joy, curiosity, and subtle creativity. And the effect in turn shaped the camp environment. Calm, engaged prisoners resulted in smoother routines, fewer conflicts, and moments of quiet amusement, even for those enforcing discipline. The comics, trivial as they seemed, became instruments of social balance, a reminder that human imagination cannot be confined. The Rocky Mountains, silent sentinels of time, witnessed this improbable theater. Sunlight filtered through the barracks windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits of laughter past. Shadows stretching long across wooden floors, and in those shadows, the human imprint persisted. The comics' influence extended beyond mere amusement. They were catalysts for expression, collaboration, and memory formation. Soldiers replayed scenes in whispers, imitated characters, and dramatized plots. Gestures, glances, and soft laughter became rituals of shared experience. The human scene, ephemeral in the moment, became indelible in memory. And decades later, the legacy endured. Memoirs, interviews, and historical studies recount the impact of these comics not merely as entertainment, but as cultural and psychological interventions. One former POW reflected, "The comics. We laughed, we imagined we were human. Confined bodies, free minds. That is what I remember most." This echoes through time, illustrating the capacity of stories to sustain, uplift, and humanize, even in the harshest environments. Fact and folklore converge, creating a narrative that is simultaneously instructive, whimsical, and profoundly human. In the final analysis, the aftermath is not dramatic in a conventional sense. No battles fought, no weapons drawn, yet it is deeply consequential. The Colorado POW camps, 1944. Wooden barracks, barbed wire guards on patrol, and comic books vibrant in imagination, absurd in reality, shaping morale, social bonds, and memory. Soldiers emerged with more than survival. They carried stories, laughter, and lessons of resilience, artifacts of the human spirit's persistence. These small, absurd moments became threads weaving the fabric of experience, connecting men across space, time, and circumstance. And so the echoes remain. In diaries, letters, memoirs, photographs, the legacy of improbability and imagination, resilience, and humor. A testament to the capacity of human beings to find life, laughter, and meaning, even in the midst of war. The comics, though small, are immortalized in memory and legend. Their impact far exceeding their size, their color, or their pages, shaping a narrative that endures beyond the barracks, beyond the mountains, beyond the war itself. The Rocky Mountains stand silent. Barracks, empty shadows, stretching long across dusted floors. Yet the laughter lingers, echoing in memory. The comic books, absurd and trivial, leave a mark far greater than their pages. Soldiers once confined, once disciplined and weary, discovered joy, wonder, a fleeting freedom inside wooden walls. Even decades later, the echoes persist. Stories, whispered memoirs, recounted photographs, studied. Proof that imagination, humor, and human connection endure, even in captivity, even amidst war. The absurdity of superheroes in a prison camp became a testament to resilience, camaraderie, and the unbreakable spirit of the human mind. Small, improbable victories etched into history. And so the story closes, not with gunfire, not with orders, not with victory or defeat, but with a quiet, lasting truth in the most improbable moments. Humanity prevails. Imagination survives. And even the tiniest spark of wonder can leave a legacy that outlives barbed wire mountains and war itself.